Jasmine Crockett was a name that people couldn't stop talking about. She wasn't just another politician, she was a force to be reckoned with. Born and raised in Texas, Jasmine had always been someone who stood up for what she believed in. Her journey from a small-town girl to a national figure was nothing short of inspiring. Growing up, she watched her parents work tirelessly to make ends meet, and those early struggles shaped her into the fighter she became. After earning her law degree, Jasmine quickly made a name for herself as an attorney who didn't back down, no matter how tough the case or how powerful the opponent. But it wasn't just her legal skills that set her apart. It was her personality. Jasmine had this magnetic energy that drew people in. Whether she was speaking at a community event or arguing in court, her words carried weight. She spoke with passion, conviction, and a touch of humor that made even the most serious topics feel relatable. It wasn't long before people started urging her to run for office. At first, Jasmine hesitated. Politics wasn't something she had ever imagined for herself. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she could make a bigger impact if she stepped into the political arena. When Jasmine finally decided to run for Congress, she did so with one goal in mind: to give a voice to those who felt voiceless. Her campaign wasn't flashy or overly polished. Instead, it was raw and real, much like Jasmine herself. She traveled across her district, meeting people face to face, listening to their stories, and promising to fight for them in Washington. Her authenticity resonated with voters, and when the election results came in, there was no doubt. Jasmine Crockett was headed to Capitol Hill. Once in Congress, Jasmine wasted no time making her presence known. She quickly became a favorite among progressives, thanks to her bold speeches and unapologetic stance on issues like racial justice, economic inequality, and women's rights. Her colleagues admired her fearlessness, though some admitted privately that debating her could be intimidating. Jasmine didn't shy away from challenging powerful figures, whether they were corporate executives testifying before Congress or fellow lawmakers whose views clashed with hers. Every time she stood up to speak, cameras rolled, and social media lit up with reactions to her fiery delivery. One day, while preparing for an upcoming Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, Jasmine came across a name that caught her attention: J.D. Vance. The Ohio senator had been making waves with his controversial opinions, particularly on issues like poverty and race. Known for his blunt style and polarizing statements, Vance was often described as both brilliant and infuriating. Some praised him for his honesty, while others accused him of oversimplifying complex problems. Either way, he was impossible to ignore. As Jasmine read through Vance's recent interviews, one particular quote jumped out at her. He had referred to certain Americans as lazy, implying that their struggles were self-inflicted rather than systemic. To Jasmine, this was not only offensive but dangerously misleading. Having grown up surrounded by hard-working families who still struggled to get by, she knew firsthand how unfair such generalizations were. Determined to hold Vance accountable, she decided to use the upcoming hearing as an opportunity to confront him directly. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with preparation. Jasmine pored over Vance's past statements, analyzing every word to identify inconsistencies and weak points. She also reached out to experts in economics and sociology, gathering data to support her arguments. Her team worked tirelessly alongside her, crafting questions designed to expose the flaws in Vance's reasoning. By the time the hearing arrived, Jasmine felt ready, or so she thought. What Jasmine didn't anticipate was the level of intensity the encounter would bring. When she walked into the Senate chamber that morning, the air buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the walls, eager to capture whatever drama might unfold. As Jasmine took her seat, she glanced across the room at J.D. Vance. He sat calmly, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Jasmine felt a flicker of unease. Still, she pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself why she was there. When her turn came to question Vance, Jasmine leaned forward, her voice steady but charged with purpose. "Senator Vance," she began, locking eyes with him, "you've recently made comments suggesting that certain Americans are lazy. Can you explain what evidence you're basing these claims on?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Vance. Jasmine's tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for evasion. She followed up with a series of pointed questions, each one aimed at dismantling his argument. For a while, it seemed like Jasmine was dominating the exchange. Her questions were sharp, her delivery flawless. But as Vance listened quietly, something shifted. There was a glimmer of confidence in his gaze, a subtle hint that he wasn't rattled in the slightest. And when it was finally his turn to respond, Jasmine realized she might have underestimated him, and that realization sent a chill down her spine. Despite the tension building inside her, Jasmine maintained her composure. She reminded herself that this wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about standing up for the millions of people who relied on leaders like her to advocate for them. Little did she know, this confrontation would become a defining moment, not only for her career but also for the way she viewed herself as a leader. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing began as any other formal session would, with a mix of anticipation, formality, and the quiet hum of murmured conversations among attendees. Reporters jotted down notes, cameras clicked softly in the background, and senators shuffled their papers, preparing for another day of questioning witnesses and discussing policy. But this wasn't just another routine hearing. The room carried an electric charge, almost tangible, because everyone knew what was coming. Jasmine Crockett versus J.D. Vance. Jasmine had spent days preparing for this moment, rehearsing her questions, and refining her arguments until they were razor sharp. She wanted to leave no room for misinterpretation or evasion. As she sat at the long wooden table surrounded by colleagues and observers, her heart pounded with a mix of excitement and nerves. This wasn't her first time taking on a high-profile opponent, but something about J.D. Vance felt different. He was unpredictable, intelligent, and unafraid to push back, qualities that made him both fascinating and dangerous. When it was finally her turn to speak, Jasmine took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and leaned forward slightly toward the microphone. Her posture was deliberate, confident yet approachable. "Senator Vance," she began, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the low buzz of the room like a knife. All eyes turned to her, including Vance's. His expression remained calm, almost neutral, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his gaze, as though he was waiting to see how far she'd go. "You've recently made comments suggesting that certain Americans are lazy," Jasmine continued, letting the word hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Can you explain what evidence you're basing these claims on?" The question landed with precision, sharp enough to demand attention but polite enough not to seem confrontational. It was a calculated move, one designed to put Vance on the defensive without crossing into outright hostility. Vance didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her for a brief second before responding. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his tone measured but firm. "My comments have been taken out of context. I'm talking about systemic issues, not individual failures." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, sensing a gap in his logic. Before he could elaborate further, she pressed on. "Systemic issues? That's interesting," she replied, leaning even closer to the microphone now. "Because when I hear words like lazy, I don't think of systems, I think of people. Real people who wake up every morning trying to provide for their families, despite the odds stacked against them." Her voice softened slightly here, adding a human element to her argument. "So tell me, Senator, do you really believe that someone working 2 jobs to make ends meet is lazy?" The room grew quieter still, the tension thickening as Jasmine paused for effect. Vance shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table. He seemed unfazed, but Jasmine noticed the subtle change in his demeanor, a slight tightening around his jawline perhaps, or the way his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She had struck a nerve and she knew it. But Vance was no stranger to tough questions. In fact, he thrived under pressure, using it to sharpen his own responses. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a hint of irritation, though he masked it well beneath layers of composure. "I appreciate your passion, Congresswoman," he said, giving her a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But let's not confuse anecdotal stories with broader truths. Yes, there are hardworking individuals everywhere, but we also can't ignore the cultural factors that contribute to dependency. Cultural factors? Jasmine echoed, her tone incredulous now. She leaned back slightly, folding her arms across her chest as if bracing herself for the next volley. Are you saying that entire communities are dependent because of their culture? Do you realize how problematic that sounds? The room erupted into murmurs, some nodding in agreement with Jasmine while others whispered support for Vance. Both sides were invested now, hanging on every word exchanged between the two politicians. Vance hesitated for only a fraction of a second before firing back. What I'm saying is that we need to address root causes instead of simply throwing money at problems. Welfare. Programs are essential, yes, but they shouldn't replace personal responsibility. His delivery was smooth, practiced, and laced with just enough charm to win over skeptics. Yet Jasmine wasn't convinced, and she wasn't about to let him off the hook. Personal responsibility? She shot back, her voice rising slightly, but never losing its clarity. Tell that to the single mother working overtime shifts while raising 3 kids. Tell that to the factory worker laid off because his job was outsourced overseas. Tell that to the student drowning in debt after pursuing higher education. Are you saying they lack personal responsibility? Each example hit like a punch, forcing Vance to defend himself against increasingly specific scenarios. For the first time since the exchange began, Vance appeared momentarily caught off guard. He glanced down at his notes, then back up at Jasmine, searching for the right words. When he finally responded, his tone was sharper than before. Let's be clear, Congresswoman. I'm not dismissing anyone's struggles. What I am saying is that we need solutions that empower people rather than enabling cycles of dependency. The phrase cycles of dependency hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with implications. Jasmine's jaw tightened, her patience wearing thin. She had expected Vance to dance around the issue, but hearing him repeat such a loaded term ignited a fire within her. Empowerment doesn't come from blaming vulnerable populations for societal failures, she countered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. It comes from addressing inequality, investing in education, and creating opportunities, not perpetuating harmful stereotypes. By now, the room was alive with energy. Senators exchanged glances, reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The debate had escalated beyond policy disagreements. It had become personal, raw, and deeply emotional. Jasmine could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to back down. Every fiber of her being was focused on dismantling Vance's arguments piece by piece. As the exchange wore on, however, Jasmine began to notice something unsettling. Despite her best efforts, Vance wasn't crumbling under the pressure. If anything, he seemed to grow more composed with each passing minute. His answers, though frustratingly vague at times, were delivered with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Worse still, he had started turning the conversation back on her, subtly questioning her understanding of rural America, an area he claimed she couldn't possibly relate to given her urban upbringing. You're passionate, Congresswoman, Vance said at one point, his tone almost patronizing, but passion alone doesn't solve complex problems. We need practical solutions grounded in reality, not idealism. The comment stung, not because it was entirely false, but because it hinted at a vulnerability Jasmine hadn't anticipated. For all her preparation, for all her fiery rhetoric, she suddenly felt exposed, as if Vance had peeled back a layer of armor she didn't know she was wearing. The realization hit her like a wave, leaving her momentarily speechless. She had walked into the hearing expecting to dominate the conversation, to expose Vance's flaws and emerge victorious. But now, sitting across from him, she realized she might have underestimated him, and that scared her. Not because she feared losing the argument, but because she feared losing the trust of those counting on her to represent them. Still, Jasmine refused to let the moment defeat her. Drawing on years of experience as a lawyer and advocate, she steadied herself and delivered one final retort. Practical solutions require empathy, Senator, she said, her voice unwavering despite the turmoil brewing inside her. And empathy requires listening, not lecturing. With that, she leaned back in her chair, signaling the end of her questioning. The room fell silent once more, the weight of the exchange settling over everyone present. Jasmine exhaled slowly, her hands clasped tightly together beneath the table. She had fought hard, harder than she thought possible, but the victory she sought felt elusive. Little did she know, this confrontation would linger in her mind long after the hearing ended, challenging her in ways she never expected. The hearing room began to empty as the session drew to a close. Senators rose from their seats, chatting casually with colleagues or hurrying off to their next meeting. Reporters packed up their equipment, already buzzing about the fiery exchange between Jasmine Crockett and J.D. Vance. But for Jasmine, the noise around her faded into the background. Her mind was still racing, replaying every word she had said and every response Vance had thrown back at her. As she gathered her notes, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. It wasn't just that Vance had held his ground. It was the way he had done it. He hadn't yelled or lost his temper. Instead, he had stayed calm, almost unnervingly so, delivering each rebuttal with precision. Worse yet, he had managed to turn parts of the conversation back on her, questioning not just her arguments but her understanding of the very people she claimed to represent. That last jab about empathy had stung more than she cared to admit. Jasmine's staff noticed her unusually quiet demeanor as they walked together down the long marble hallway of the Capitol building. "You were great in there," one of them said encouragingly, trying to break the silence. Vance didn't know what hit him. Another chimed in. "Yeah, you really called him out on those stereotypes. People are gonna love that." But Jasmine didn't respond right away. She forced a small smile, nodding politely, but inside she felt anything but reassured. The truth was, she didn't feel like she'd won. Not entirely. Sure, she had landed some solid punches, pointing out flaws in Vance's reasoning and calling attention to the harm caused by his words. But Vance had given as good as he got, and worse, he had made her doubt herself, even if only for a moment. And doubt, Jasmine knew, was dangerous in politics. Confidence was currency, and losing it could cost you everything. Back in her office, later that evening, Jasmine sat alone at her desk, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. She had replayed the hearing footage several times now, pausing at key moments to analyze Vance's responses. Each time she found herself focusing less on what he had said and more on how he had said it. His tone had been steady, almost clinical, devoid of the emotional charge that usually accompanied debates like this. It was as though he had anticipated every move she made, countering her points with practiced ease. What bothered Jasmine most, though, was the way Vance had subtly shifted the narrative. By framing his comments as being about systemic issues rather than personal attacks, he had created a buffer against accusations of bias or insensitivity. When she pressed him on specific examples, he deflected by talking about broader trends and cultural factors, terms vague enough to sound reasonable but loaded enough to provoke strong reactions. And when all else failed, he turned the focus back on her, implying that her urban background limited her perspective. It was a clever strategy, one that Jasmine grudgingly respected even as it frustrated her. Vance hadn't just defended himself, he had dismantled her confidence bit by bit, leaving her questioning whether she had truly understood the depth of his arguments, or worse, whether she had misrepresented them. For someone who prided herself on preparation and precision, this realization was unsettling. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from a friend and fellow lawmaker. "Saw the hearing. You crushed it. Don't let Vance get under your skin." Jasmine sighed, staring at the message without responding. Crushed it? Maybe. But she also couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that Vance had gotten the better of her in some intangible way. To distract herself, Jasmine scrolled through social media, curious to see how the public was reacting. As expected, opinions were divided. Some praised her for taking on Vance and exposing the flaws in his rhetoric. Others criticized her for coming across as overly aggressive or dismissive of rural perspectives. A few commentators even echoed Vance's remarks, suggesting that her arguments lacked nuance because of her background. Reading these comments felt like a punch to the gut. Was she really that out of touch? Frustrated, Jasmine closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. She hated feeling this way. Doubtful, vulnerable, unsure of herself. Politics was a game of perception, and right now she feared that Vance had scored a psychological victory, even if the official scorecard showed otherwise. But as much as she wanted to push those feelings aside, she knew she couldn't ignore them. They were telling her something important, that she needed to evolve. Over the next few days, Jasmine spent hours reflecting on the encounter. She replayed Vance's arguments in her head, dissecting them to understand where she might have missed opportunities to counter more effectively. She also revisited her own statements, looking for areas where she could have been clearer or more persuasive. What she realized was both humbling and enlightening. While she had approached the hearing with facts and passion, Vance had come armed with storytelling and relatability. He had framed his points in ways that resonated emotionally, even when they weren't logically sound. This insight sparked a deeper question for Jasmine. Was she relying too heavily on data and logic at the expense of connecting with people on a human level? After all, policy debates weren't just intellectual exercises, they were battles for hearts and minds. And while facts mattered, emotions often carried more weight. If she wanted to be truly effective, she would need to strike a balance between the two. Determined to learn from the experience, Jasmine decided to take action. She reached out to trusted mentors and colleagues, asking for feedback on her performance during the hearing. To her surprise, many of them echoed similar observations. Yes, she had been articulate, and force more is pending completion due to character limits. Jasmine Crockett wasn't one to dwell on setbacks for too long. While the hearing with J.D. Vance had left her unsettled, she refused to let it define her. Instead, she channeled her frustration into action, determined to turn what felt like a moment of vulnerability into an opportunity for growth. For Jasmine, this wasn't just about bouncing back. It was about becoming better. The first step in her journey was reconnecting with the people she served. Politics often happened behind closed doors, in committee rooms and televised hearings, where lawmakers debated policies that affected millions. But Jasmine knew that real change didn't start there. It started on the ground, with the people who lived the issues every day. So over the next few weeks, she made it her mission to visit towns and neighborhoods across her district, listening to their stories and learning from their experiences. Her schedule became a whirlwind of activity. One morning, she might be sitting at a kitchen table in a small rural town, sipping coffee with a farmer who talked about struggling to keep his land profitable. The next afternoon, she could be standing in line at a food bank in an urban neighborhood, chatting with single mothers juggling multiple jobs while raising their kids. She visited schools, factories, community centers, and churches, always asking the same question: what do you need? What can I do to help? These conversations weren't easy. Many of the people Jasmine met were dealing with challenges far beyond anything she had faced personally. Some shared heartbreaking stories of losing loved ones to addiction or violence. Others spoke about working tirelessly only to barely scrape by, burdened by medical bills or student loans. Jasmine listened intently, nodding along and taking notes, but she also allowed herself to feel, to truly absorb the weight of their struggles. It reminded her why she had entered politics in the first place, not for glory or power, but to make life better for people like these. As she traveled, Jasmine began to notice patterns in the stories she heard. Despite differences in geography, race, or income level, many of the issues people faced boiled down to the same root causes: lack of access to affordable health care, underfunded schools, stagnant wages, and systemic barriers that made upward mobility nearly impossible. These insights reinforced something she already believed: that policy solutions needed to address the big picture rather than treating symptoms in isolation. But there was another layer to these interactions that surprised Jasmine. Time and again, people thanked her simply for showing up. In some places, she was the first elected official they had ever seen visit their community. "It means a lot that you're here," one elderly woman told her during a town hall meeting in a low-income housing complex. "Most folks in Washington don't even know we exist." Those words stuck with Jasmine, reminding her how important visibility and representation were. Being present mattered almost as much as the policies themselves. While traveling, Jasmine also took time to reflect on her own approach to advocacy. Listening to people's stories helped her see the gaps in her previous methods. Yes, she had always been passionate and well-prepared, armed with data and arguments designed to win debates. But Vance's critique during the hearing, that her perspective might be limited, had struck a nerve because it contained a kernel of truth. Growing up in Texas, Jasmine had experienced hardship, but her upbringing hadn't exposed her to the realities of rural poverty or certain cultural nuances. If she wanted to represent everyone effectively, she needed to broaden her understanding. To bridge this gap, Jasmine sought out experts and advocates who specialized in areas outside her comfort zone. She attended workshops on rural economic development, read books about Appalachian culture, a region J.D. Vance frequently referenced, and engaged in conversations with leaders from diverse backgrounds. This process wasn't always comfortable. There were moments when she felt out of her depth, but it was humbling and eye-opening. Slowly but surely, Jasmine began to piece together a more holistic view of the problems facing her constituents and the country as a whole. Back in Washington, armed with fresh insights and renewed determination, Jasmine decided to take a different approach to her work. Rather than focusing solely on fiery speeches and confrontations, she shifted her energy toward building coalitions and crafting legislation that addressed the root causes of inequality. Her staff noticed the change immediately. Meetings became collaborative brainstorming sessions instead of strategy briefings. Press releases emphasized solutions over sound bites. Even her social media posts took on a warmer tone, highlighting personal stories alongside policy updates. One of Jasmine's first major initiatives after her travels was introducing a bill aimed at expanding access to affordable childcare, a critical issue she had heard repeatedly from working parents. To build support, she partnered with colleagues from both parties, framing the proposal as a practical solution rather than a partisan agenda item. She also invited several of the individuals she had met during her travels to testify before Congress, giving them a platform to share their experiences directly with lawmakers. Their testimonies were powerful, bringing tears to the eyes of even the most stoic senators and representatives. The response to Jasmine's efforts was overwhelmingly positive. Constituents praised her for listening and acting on their concerns. Colleagues who had once dismissed her as overly combative now respected her ability to collaborate and find common ground. Even critics acknowledged that her new approach seemed more thoughtful and inclusive. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Some accused her of softening her stance or pandering to opposing viewpoints, but Jasmine didn't mind. She knew that meaningful progress required compromise, and she was willing to make sacrifices if it meant achieving results. Through it all, Jasmine couldn't help but think back to her clash with J.D. Vance. At the time, she had viewed it as a failure, a moment when she had been caught off guard and forced to confront her own limitations. But looking at everything she had accomplished since then, she realized it had been a turning point. Vance's words may have stung, but they had also pushed her to grow. Without that confrontation, she might never have taken the steps necessary to become a more effective leader. As weeks turned into months, Jasmine found herself increasingly at peace with the experience. She still disagreed with Vance on nearly every issue, and she remained committed to challenging him whenever necessary. But she no longer saw him, or their exchange, as a threat. Instead, she viewed it as a lesson, one that had ultimately strengthened her resolve and deepened her connection to the people she served. In hindsight, Jasmine understood that true leadership wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about learning from them. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, she faced them with confidence, knowing she was stronger and wiser than before. After all, every great leader has moments of doubt, What sets them apart is how they rise after falling. For Jasmine Crockett, this was just the beginning of her comeback story, one that promised to inspire countless others along the way. Jasmine Crockett's transformation didn't happen overnight, but as the weeks turned into months, the changes became impossible to ignore. Her colleagues in Congress began to notice a shift, not just in her policies or her approach to debates, but in the way she carried herself. Gone was the fiery attorney who relied solely on sharp words and relentless confrontation. In her place stood a more measured, thoughtful leader, who still fought fiercely for justice but did so with a newfound sense of purpose and empathy. One of the most visible signs of Jasmine's evolution was her ability to build bridges across party lines. Politics in Washington had long been defined by division, with lawmakers often retreating into ideological bunkers rather than seeking common ground. But Jasmine decided early on that she wouldn't let polarization dictate her actions. She reached out to Republicans, independents, and even those within her own party, whose views differed from hers. These conversations weren't always easy. There were tense moments, heated disagreements, and plenty of skepticism. But they taught her an important lesson. Progress required patience and persistence. Take, for example, her work on a bipartisan bill addressing rural broadband access. For years, this issue had languished in committee, dismissed by urban lawmakers as irrelevant to their constituents and ignored by rural representatives who felt powerless to secure funding. But Jasmine saw it differently. During her travels, she had met countless families struggling to keep up with modern life because they lacked reliable internet, students unable to complete homework assignments online, farmers unable to access real-time market prices, small business owners unable to reach customers beyond their immediate area. These stories stayed with her, fueling her determination to act. To move the needle, Jasmine partnered with Senator Rachel Hayes, a conservative from Nebraska whose district faced similar challenges. At first, their collaboration raised eyebrows. Critics accused Jasmine of selling out or diluting her progressive values. Supporters worried she was wasting time trying to win over opponents who would never budge. But Jasmine remained undeterred. She knew that solving complex problems required input from all sides, and she was willing to put in the effort to make it happen. The two women spent hours drafting language for the bill, hashing out compromises that satisfied both rural and urban priorities. They held joint press conferences, emphasizing the shared benefits of expanding broadband access. When skeptics questioned the feasibility of the proposal, Jasmine leaned on the personal stories she had collected during her travels, reminding everyone that this wasn't just about policy. It was about people. By the time the bill passed, with overwhelming bipartisan support, it was clear that Jasmine's strategy had worked. More importantly, it proved that collaboration wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. But Jasmine's growth extended beyond legislative victories. On a personal level, she found herself approaching conflicts and critics with a greater sense of humility. J.D. Vance, for instance, continued to be a thorn in her side. Their paths crossed occasionally at hearings or public events, and while their interactions remained professional, there was no denying the underlying tension between them. Yet instead of avoiding him or lashing out, Jasmine chose to engage. She asked questions, listened to his perspectives, even when she disagreed, and looked for areas where they might find alignment. It wasn't about liking each other, it was about understanding each other. This willingness to listen paid off in unexpected ways. During one particularly contentious Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, Vance surprised everyone, including Jasmine, by offering mild praise for her recent legislative efforts. Congresswoman Crockett has shown a commendable commitment to addressing systemic issues, he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. While we may differ on certain approaches, I respect her dedication to finding solutions. The comment caught Jasmine off guard, but she accepted it graciously, thanking Vance for his acknowledgement. Later, when reporters pressed her for a reaction, she smiled and said simply, "Progress isn't about agreeing on everything, it's about working together despite our differences." Of course, Jasmine's journey wasn't without its challenges. There were days when doubt crept back in, whispering that she wasn't doing enough or that her efforts wouldn't lead to lasting change. Some critics dismissed her new approach as performative, accusing her of chasing headlines rather than tackling tough issues. Others worried that her emphasis on compromise came at the expense of bold, progressive ideas. Even her closest allies sometimes urged her to return to her roots, to channel the fiery energy that had made her such a compelling figure in the first place. Jasmine acknowledged these concerns, but she refused to let them derail her. She reminded herself, and anyone who doubted her, that leadership wasn't a one-size-fits-all endeavor. Yes, there was value in speaking truth to power, in calling out injustice without hesitation. But there was also value in listening, in meeting people where they were and finding ways to move forward together. Both approaches had their place, and Jasmine was determined to strike a balance. Her confidence grew with each success, however, small. Whether it was securing funding for a local community center, advocating for criminal justice reform, or championing environmental protections, Jasmine approached every challenge with renewed vigor. She celebrated victories, learned from failures, and embraced the messy, unpredictable nature of politics. And through it all, she kept her focus squarely on the people she served, the ones who had inspired her journey in the first place. By the end of the year, Jasmine's reputation had shifted in subtle but significant ways. She was still known as a fierce advocate for equality and justice, but now she was also recognized as a pragmatic problem solver, someone who could navigate the complexities of Washington without losing sight of her values. Her speeches became less about tearing down opponents and more about lifting up communities. Her social media posts highlighted not just the problems facing the nation, but also the innovative solutions being implemented across the country. Perhaps the most telling sign of Jasmine's growth came during a town hall meeting in her home district. A young woman stood up and asked, "How do you stay hopeful when things feel so divided?" Jasmine paused for a moment, considering the question. Then with a warm smile, she replied, "Hope isn't something you wait for, it's something you create. Every time we come together, every time we listen to each other and work toward a better future, we're building hope. And that's how we'll get through this. Together." The room erupted in applause, but for Jasmine, the moment was deeply personal. It reminded her of why she had started this journey and how far she had come since that fateful hearing with J.D. Vance. What had once seemed like a setback had become a catalyst for growth, pushing her to become not just a better politician, but a better person. As she left the stage that evening, surrounded by cheering constituents, Jasmine felt a quiet sense of pride, not for what she had achieved, but for the possibilities that lay ahead. For Jasmine Crockett, redemption wasn't about proving herself to others. It was about staying true to herself while evolving into the leader she was meant to be. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, she faced them with courage, knowing she had already overcome one of the toughest tests of her career. Months had passed since Jasmine Crockett's fiery exchange with J.D. Vance, but the echoes of that confrontation continued to ripple through political circles. What had started as a heated debate in a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing had evolved into something far more significant, a defining chapter in Jasmine's career and a testament to her resilience. While some viewed the clash as a momentary stumble for Jasmine, others saw it as the spark that ignited her transformation into a more thoughtful, effective leader. The media played no small role in shaping the narrative around their encounter. Political analysts dissected every word exchanged between Jasmine and Vance, replaying clips of the hearing on cable news and debating its implications. Some pundits praised Jasmine for standing up to Vance, calling her a fearless advocate for marginalized communities. Others argued that Vance's calm demeanor and calculated responses had given him the upper hand, portraying him as the victor of the verbal sparring match. Social media amplified these discussions with hashtags like #Crockett vs. Vance trending for days after the hearing. But what set Jasmine apart was how she responded to the scrutiny. Instead of retreating or lashing out, she leaned into the conversation, using it as an opportunity to highlight the very issues at the heart of their disagreement. In interviews and op-eds, she framed the clash not as a personal battle, but as a reflection of broader societal divides. "This isn't about me versus Senator Vance. she said during an appearance on a popular morning talk show. It's about having honest conversations about poverty, race, and opportunity in America. If we can't confront these truths head-on, we'll never find real solutions. Her ability to rise above the noise earned her respect from unlikely quarters. Even critics who had once dismissed her as overly combative began to acknowledge her growth. Jasmine Crockett is proving herself to be more than just a firebrand, wrote one columnist in a prominent newspaper. She's showing us what it means to lead with both passion and purpose. Another commentator noted, in a world where politicians often double down on their mistakes, Crockett's willingness to reflect and adapt is refreshing and rare. For J.D. Vance, the aftermath of the hearing was equally complex. His supporters hailed his performance as evidence of his intellectual rigor and unflappability under pressure. They pointed to his ability to deflect Jasmine's attacks while staying focused on his core message as proof of his potential as a national figure. Yet not everyone was convinced. Some accused him of dodging accountability by cloaking his controversial views in vague language. Critics argued that his critique of dependency lacked nuance and risked alienating vulnerable populations. The polarized reactions underscored the challenges of navigating public life in an era defined by tribalism and distrust. Despite their ideological differences, Jasmine and Vance occasionally found themselves crossing paths at hearings, conferences, and other official events. Their interactions remained cordial but tinged with an underlying tension, a reminder of the unresolved questions between them. Still, Jasmine made a conscious effort to treat Vance with respect, even when their disagreements flared. She understood that demonizing opponents rarely led to productive outcomes, and she wanted to model a different kind of leadership, one rooted in civility and mutual understanding. As time went on, the legacy of their clash took shape in unexpected ways. For many Americans, the exchange served as a microcosm of the larger cultural and political battles playing out across the country. It highlighted the power dynamics at play when two strong personalities with opposing worldviews collided. But it also demonstrated the importance of listening, even when it felt uncomfortable. Jasmine's decision to engage with Vance's arguments rather than dismiss them outright resonated with people who were tired of the same old partisan gridlock. Perhaps most importantly, the confrontation inspired countless individuals to speak up and get involved. Young activists in particular cited Jasmine's courage as a source of motivation. Seeing someone like Congresswoman Crockett stand up for what's right even when it's hard makes me want to do the same, said O, a college student at a rally organized by a progressive advocacy group. Others drew inspiration from her journey of self-reflection and growth, seeing it as a powerful example of how setbacks could become stepping stones to success. By the end of the year, Jasmine's efforts began to bear fruit in tangible ways. Several of the bills she championed, including the Rural Broadband Expansion Initiative, gained traction and received funding. Her focus on economic justice and systemic reform earned her recognition from advocacy groups and think tanks alike. When award season rolled around, she was named Legislator of the Year by a coalition of grassroots organizations committed to advancing equity and inclusion. Accepting the honor, Jasmine humbly dedicated it to the people who had inspired her along the way. Change doesn't come from speeches or sound bites, she told the audience gathered for the ceremony. It comes from action, from rolling up our sleeves and doing the hard work of building bridges, breaking down barriers, and creating opportunities for everyone. None of us can do this alone. We need each other, our voices, our ideas, our shared humanity, to move forward. Her words struck a chord, earning a standing ovation that rippled through the room. For Jasmine, the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, it was a validation of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. On the other, it was a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. Progress, she knew, was never linear. It required constant vigilance and unwavering determination. Looking back on the year, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude, not just for the victories, but for the lessons learned along the way. Her clash with J.D. Vance had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and her approach to leadership. It had pushed her to grow in ways she hadn't anticipated, deepening her empathy and expanding her vision for what was possible. And while she would always carry a piece of that experience with her, it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become part of her story, a story of resilience, reinvention, and relentless hope. As she stood on stage that evening, surrounded by applause and admiration, Jasmine allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. She thought about the young girl she used to be, dreaming of a better future for herself and her family. She thought about the struggles that had shaped her, the hardships, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt. And she thought about the millions of people counting on leaders like her to fight for a fairer, more compassionate world. For Jasmine Crockett, the journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new debates, and new opportunities to make a difference, but one thing was certain: she was ready. Ready to listen, to learn, and to lead, with humility, heart, and an unshakable belief in the power of collective action. Because in the end, it wasn't about winning arguments or scoring political points. It was about leaving the world better than she found it, and that, she realized, was a mission worth dedicating her life to.